Howdy, sociologists, and welcome to lesson 11 on ethnicity. So, our learning goals for today are: you're going to know how a country can be welcoming or unwelcoming to migrants. Australia is fairly welcoming. As a migrant myself, I would agree. That's true. And be able to write an extended response. Okay, let's get to it. Australian multiculturalism. What do we got to say about this topic? Dr. Tim Self-Formanasane, I'm definitely saying that wrong. I should have practiced, but I didn't. Anyway, he's the former race discrimination commissioner. He was there for about 5 years. His term ended in 2018. Anyway, he had some interesting things to say. He said that Australians are not absolutely culturally relative. Yeah? So they're not completely ethnocentric and they're not completely culturally relative. Remember, we talked about the fact that there's a scale between extreme cultural relativity and extreme ethnocentrism. Most Australians are in the middle there somewhere. Australians do expect migrants to eventually adopt Australian customs. Yeah, that's just a fact. For example, they expect them to learn English. And it does happen, right? This is 80% of migrants who have come to Australia since 2010 have become citizens, which is a sign that they want to be here permanently. So here you can see there's a whole website about race discrimination on the humanrights.gov.au website. All kinds of stuff there, all their publications, current and past projects, guides. There you go. Sharing stories of Australian Muslims is one of their top projects at the moment. And there's the current race discrimination officer, Mr. Chin Tan. There he is there. He's been doing that for about 1.5 years. And welcoming migrants. Other countries are not as welcoming as Australia is. For example, in Japan, the government only communicates to people in Japanese. So if you don't speak Japanese, you got problems. Whereas in Australia, as we've talked about, the government provides information for migrants in their own language. Some aren't actively trying to grow their population via migration yet. This is something that Australia is actively trying to do. They're actively trying to increase their population through migration. Yeah, Australia's found that economically, having a big population is good, and our natural growth rate through births is not that high, so we're doing it through migration. Some other countries find that unskilled migrants have a difficult time getting work. That's still true a little bit in Australia, but it's not too bad. Yes, yet many migrants still fear deportation, even from Australia. So even though Australia is welcoming, this thing is still in the back of your mind. I mean, again, I'm just giving you my personal experience here, but New Zealanders who don't have Australian citizenship, even if they were brought here by their parents when they were 1, if they commit a really bad crime, can be sent back to New Zealand, even if they've got no life there at all. True. So there's an organisation called the Centre for Global Development, and they have worked out which countries they think have the most migrant-friendly policies. And there's the list from most migrant-friendly to least. So there's Australia, number 3, right up the top there. Congratulations, Australia. Okay, a hilarious little activity here for you all. I want you to imagine the worst country in the world for migrants. Yeah? Imagine a country that had the worst, least welcoming environment for migrants. I want you to write 4 sentences describing what that country might be like. Fun. Okay, now it's time to watch a video. It's called Do We Need a Race Commissioner? It's by Tom Ballard from Tonightly on the ABC, and it's comedy because he's making the point that yes, we do. But anyway, check it out.
This is Australia's current Race Discrimination Commissioner, and his name is on everybody's lips.
Tim Soutphommasane.
Tim Soutphommasane.
Soutphommasane.
Dr. Supermarsens.
Tim Soupy.
Soup Parmesani.
Ooh, close enough. Dr. Tim
Soutphommasane
will step down from his role this month, and the government's been busy looking for his replacement. The gig's all about building communities where people of all cultures and backgrounds feel safe and included. It pays a sweet $350K a year and seems to involve dealing with some of the worst camera work I've ever seen in my goddamn life. Ahead of the new commissioner being announced, some critics have called on the government to abolish the role altogether. Critics like Gideon Rosner from the Institute of Public Affairs.
Does Australia need this man?
No, it does not need the position that man holds. It doesn't need a race discrimination commissioner.
What's his name?
Tim Soutphommasane. I spent a long time practicing.
It's a tricky one.
It is hard, yeah. It's harder to spell when I did my notes, actually. But no.
Come on.
No. Cannot. Soutphommasane, I think.
Okay, no.
No.
Double M.
Double M.
One S.
All right, I'll go back to the drawing board.
Racist. All right, let's take a look at some of Tim Soutphommasane's work. This is his Racism It Stops With Me campaign ad.
Racism
has no place in sport.
Racism! Racism! It stops with me!
It stops with me.
It stops with me.
With me. With me.
With me.
Racism! It stops with me!
Thoughts?
Any racist crank who's genuinely a racist, bigoted, terrible person won't look at that ad and say, oh, gee, I better stop being a racist.
Have you ever experienced racism?
Have you?
No.
No.
I feel like I'm looking into a mirror right now. We should get rid of race out of our institutions.
Well, we should stop talking about race so damn much.
Stop talking about race.
I'm bored with race.
It's so boring.
Well,
we don't want to talk about race.
It's old.
Who cares about race?
We hear about it too much.
Race and racism doesn't affect us.
Well,
Too right, Gideon. In May, Queensland LNP Senator Ian MacDonald questioned whether there is even enough racism in Australia to merit a National Race Discrimination Commissioner.
I might live in a bubble, perhaps, but I find it very difficult to find any but very rare cases of racism in Australia. In my own society, up in Eyre, the greatest hero, in fact, the King of North Queensland, is Jonathan Thurston, who, if only I could get him to run for a political party, he'd walk it in. You know, there are obviously isolated aspects of racism in Australia, but I would think across the board they're very isolated.
There you have it. We probably don't even need a Race Discrimination Commissioner because racism in Australia has practically died out like the Tasmanian tiger or snap bracelets. To make sure that's definitely correct, I headed to Senator MacDonald's isolated bubble of North Queensland, specifically the city of Townsville, Queensland's tidiest town of 2007, and the National Indigenous Human Rights Congress's racist city of 2004. I sat down with Max Lanoy, a lecturer at James Cook University. Max, just how rare and isolated is racism in these parts?
It's neither rare nor isolated. It comes in different forms.
Well, Senator Ian MacDonald grew up around here and he said...
The only odium some of the Indigenous people suffered at my school was that they were better sportsmen than us, and you'd be flat out to try and tackle them, but that was purely on a competitive sporting basis, absolutely nothing to do with racism.
Now, your mum went to school with Ian MacDonald. Was she often tackled for her sporting prowess?
No, she never really played rugby league, but I'm sure she wasn't allowed to play rugby league back in those days.
So she experienced no racism whatsoever then?
No, certainly it did tackle her, but not on the sporting field. So she was restricted from going beyond primary school, and that was racism, because Indigenous kids weren't allowed to enter high school at that time.
Okay, so the racism was really just isolated to the primary school years. Isn't Jonathan Thurston proof that racism is fixed in Townsville?
No.
Jessica Mauboy?
No.
Leland Chin?
No.
Crystal Lee?
That's racist.
Max Lanoy was adamant that Senator MacDonald had it wrong. He decided to take me on a tour of racism in Townsville. Fun fact, Townsville was named after Robert Towns, who was a successful slave trader.
So this is Boundary Street. In our segregation part of the history of Australia and Townsville, this is an example of where racism started. So if you were caught within the city limits on that side of the road at a certain time of day, you could be then arrested and sent over to Palm Island.
Hey Max, I came over, it's fine over here, I don't know what you're talking about. It's all good, no racism over here.
So Tom, even as recent as January this year, allegedly 2 young Aboriginal boys were told that they weren't allowed to enter this store after 6 p.m.
Yeah, okay.
It still exists.
Yeah, but that's isolated. The racism is isolated to this Woolworths after 6 p.m. It's fine. Anyway, this was all just isolated in Townsville. Isolated. And Senator McDonald was talking about his community of Ayr, so we decided to go there until we found out that people put up these signs there telling anyone who isn't of Northern European descent to fuck off, and so we skipped it. Instead, I hit the streets around Senator McDonald's office to talk to the residents of this paradise of racial harmony.
Do you think there's any racism in Townsville?
Probably, yes.
Yeah?
A lot.
I've heard a lot of Aboriginal people talk about it.
Have you ever done or said anything that might be considered racist?
Me?
Yeah.
No.
You sure?
No.
This is Dr. Tim Sapamathan, Australia's Race Discrimination Commissioner. He gets paid over $300,000 a year to try and stop racism.
Stop it?
Yeah.
Yeah, right on. He owns that Chinese shop down the road at Stir Fry. He does a good Saturday beef.
No.
Oh, I seen him the other day on TV, yeah. He's the bloke meeting Trump today.
So, do you think racism is a problem in Townsville?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks, Townsville. No racism. Good job. Despite my findings, the Australian government seems committed to maintaining a commissioner for racial whinging.
The Attorney-General, Christian Porter, has made explicit what kind of candidate they are looking for, and that's someone with an understanding and empathy not merely for minority groups, but for middle Australian values.
You don't want the role to exist. Some people want the role to exist or change a little bit. I could work for less than $350,000 a year. I could represent mainstream Australian values. I've actually put together an ad that I would make if I was the Race Discrimination Commissioner. Do you mind if I show it?
Of course not.
Okay.
Love to see it.
Here we go.
Racism.
I don't see it very often. Not very often.
I may live in a bubble,
but I find it very difficult to find any but very rare cases of racism in Australia.
It's never affected me.
Or me.
Racism. It's pretty isolated.
My dad's Japanese, and racist stuff actually happens to him. I'm fine.
Jonathan Thurston exists.
I've been called a gook before, and
And Hey It's Saturday's not even on anymore.
Cool, we done?
Racism. It's pretty isolated.
Thoughts?
No, it's a cute ad, but I wouldn't like to see it on the air from the Human Rights Commission.
You wouldn't like taxes funding something like that?
No.
Well, it did, because we're on the ABC.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah.
So who will be next to fill that auspicious chair and carry on the fight against non-existent racism in Australia? Only time will tell, but probably me. He is hoping it's someone who can use the power of YouTube to tackle the rare and isolated racism that isn't even really a problem in Townsville or anywhere else. Plus, I think it should be someone with an easier name.
Dr. Sapamathan.
Tim Soupy.
Soup Parmesani.
Like 3 syllables max.
Reflection activity for this lesson is a very simple one. I want you to imagine that this lesson was an event. It was an event. It is an event, and I want you to write a headline for this lesson. Yeah, so summarize the lesson in one sentence. That's a headline. So it doesn't need to be a full sentence. Okay, today's homework is our weekly practice response. This is going to be an extended response. How has cultural diversity led to change in Australian society? And I want you to give your answer taking these 4 things into account. Yeah, these are the 4 things from the sociological imagination: historical, structural, cultural, and critical. I want you to think about those 4 things. So possibly you could use those 4 as 4 small paragraphs in your answer. And for my students, I want you to do that through our shared OneNote. The more practice responses you do, the more you are going to cane that exam. Let's just remind ourselves about what a good extended response looks like. So, how to do an extended response? You have an intro. You should already have this information. This is just to remind you. You have some paragraphs, and you use that acronym TREES: topic sentence, references, evidence, evaluation, and the sociological theory where relevant, and then a conclusion. Yeah. But the most important thing is down the bottom there. Answer the question being asked. Look for clues about how to answer the question. We already talked about that. I would recommend that you structure your answer around those 4 parts of the sociological imagination. And here are some thoughts that I've made on practice responses over the year so far. So these might be relevant when you're writing those responses. The quality of your writing is very important. Try and use less pronouns because that's vague, yeah? If you say it, just say the thing that it is standing for instead. Yeah, capitalization is important, blah, blah, blah. You can pause the video and have a look at that a bit more if you want to. And here are some more. Don't make sentences that are too long. Remember, communication is the art of getting an idea, which is this magical, invisible thing from your head into my head, okay? And clarity is the most important thing in communication. Avoid superlatives, we talked about that. Yep, explain words that you use, yeah, assume that we don't know anything. Avoid pronouns like we, I think that's already been mentioned. Give concrete examples and define terms that you use. I think we all know all of that. So that's your homework task. For those of you who are keen as beans, I want you to read those 3 pages from the textbook and also check out that video. It's a video about the Racial Discrimination Act from 1975. Check it out if you want to. Thank you so much for getting stuck into this lesson, and remember, keep it real.